All right, so we wanted to thank the Carsey-Wolf Center for hosting this event in coordination with the Media Fields Journal Conference entitled Zones of Mediation. On behalf of the conference organizers, we just wanted to express how thrilled we are to have Jessica Woodworth, co-director and co-writer of the film Altiplano, here with us today. So thank you so much, Jessica, for joining us today and having this conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you virtually.
Yes. So just to go ahead and get started, what is Altiplano for your team? How would you summarize the film? And also, can you talk a bit about the title for the film? Because as we were chatting the other day, there's a very interesting sort of history in terms of the naming of the film itself.
Sure, yeah. So I'll give a little bit of context. So this was a fiction feature film that we shot in 2008 in Peru, in the region, in the Colca Valley, so above Arequipa, so very, very high. And this is a second fiction feature that Peter Brosens and I made. He's a Belgian, Flemish film director. We had previously shot a fiction film in Mongolia in 2006, and that was our first foray into fiction filmmaking, and Altiplano became our second. But they're very closely linked, and we'll talk about that slowly but surely.
Yes, we will.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a story born from multiple sources and driven by rage, conviction that cinema has a part to play in dialogue between and amongst all of us. Yeah. And from the very start, it was a story built around two women, Saturnina, a young bride living in the high Andes, who is in a community that's been struck by a tragedy, a mercury spill. And so the community is contaminated, and she eventually takes her life in protest. And so the second pillar, main character, is Grace, this war photographer of Iranian origin, who as an incident in Iraq while she's working, her guide is assassinated, and she actually has forced to take a photograph of this assassination. So she loses her, in fact, all of her convictions there at that moment. And her husband, Max, is a Belgian cataract surgeon who works in itinerant cataract clinics, who finds himself in Peru, in this community near where Saturnina lives, in a clinic where that gets embroiled in a local conflict, and he loses his life there in a protest. And Grace makes this pilgrimage in mourning, in her bottomless grief. She makes a pilgrimage to this place in the high Andes in order to resolve this mourning process. And in effect, these two characters, Saturnina, who is drifting around as a restless spirit at that point, and Grace, who's on her pilgrimage of mourning, they cross. So it was our wish that these two women have these destinies which are seemingly extremely distant from one another through circumstance. We collapse time and space, and their lives do cross. Mm-hmm. Because our world is very small, and all of our stories are linked. And in the big picture, these are all our stories. And so we wanted to have a broken image maker cross paths with someone who is possibly invisible to some and visible to others, but who carries in her the rage of a community and commits to camera because she films her suicide. This act, heroic act, where she gives her life back to her community. So this image maker is confronted with the most potent image ever, and this starts a process of healing. So yeah, so it's it was our wish to build these two stories around a context inside an arena that had integrity.
Oh, and this is connected, I think, with the title, yes? In terms of the naming for the title and so on, and sort of that process.
Yeah. So we've made in total 6 fiction feature films, and it's become a habit to have a working title, and at the very last minute, the very end of the process, to change the title. So we were all trooping around the Andes with, the coats of the shooting crew with Fragments of Grace. This was the original title. Fragments of Grace, yeah, and as we sort of stumbled, all of us, through the whole process, production and post-production, we recognized that didn't do justice to the story. That having the name Grace in the title also drew too much attention to one of the 2 main characters, which didn't seem just. As time went on, it seemed much more appropriate to call the film Altiplano. It's where the film was shot. It's a sort of geographic space that doesn't carry judgment. It doesn't project anything. It opens the story, so you can look at it in a larger, more sweeping context, because it's quite an epic story, shot in an epic manner, and so on every level it seemed to fit the film more comfortably. It seemed to have more integrity. Yeah. So,
and speaking to this broader context, you also mentioned how the film, of course, is part of what some I'm not sure if this is your term or just what the term that some scholars have used to describe your trilogy, but an eco-crisis trilogy. So I was wondering whether you could just briefly sort of talk about the trilogies again, very quickly, sort of holistically, and then where Altiplano sort of functions as the second film in the trilogy.
Yeah, so the third film, which we shot subsequently, is called The Fifth Season, and we shot it in the forests of Belgium, and it was we had been in Mongolia working for years on Hadak, our first fiction feature, and then we were 3 years in Peru working on Altiplano. And we felt the need to work in our backyard. So we did. We shot it in our village with all of the locals. This is a habit, working very closely with the locals. We felt like we needed to tell a story that was closer to home. And it sort of completed an unintended trilogy. So the 3 films address the environmental crisis that we are all suffering through and trying to understand and trying to tackle in our own ways, so it was eventually called a trilogy, but that wasn't the intention. And the 5th season, which had a working title of Silent Spring, actually, it changed almost at the last minute in the post-production. This was built around a concept, an idea, a question, actually. What if spring didn't come? Yeah, so this was and a sort of explosive starting point. It came, it's like a thunder, and we thought, oh, and how would this manifest, and how would a small community like our own react to that? So it was a big gymnastics of the imagination. But we incorporated, like we do everywhere, wherever we're working, local emergencies. So in fact, the fact that the bees are disappearing, for example, the fact that our landscapes are becoming more and more unpredictable, and where will this lead us? So one Hadak in 2006 was it was in the context of the end of nomadism, and carries discreetly themes like the goby moving. Yeah, the goby is on the move, and so embedded in the story are all these ecological crises. And the same with Altiplano, which was had really a specific source there.
Yes, this was my next question in terms of speaking to sort of how each film is dealing with a specific sort of regional manifestation of the climate crisis. I was wondering whether you could speak about sort of, because of course we're in the film, we're in this fictional town of Torobamba, but it's based on an actual tragic real event that is still unfolding, sort of a neo-colonial event that happened in 2000 in Peru. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit about that for the audience.
Yeah, so we took our what happened was that when you make a first film, you never presume or assume that you are going to have the privilege to make a second. And we with Hadak, we had a world premiere in Venice, where we won an award, which was film stock for a new film for a second fiction feature. And so we knew, okay, we're on a roll, we're going to be able to work further. And what brought us to South America was in large part due to Peter, his years of work in Ecuador and in Peru, working in the high Andes, and more specifically a study about punitive suicide. So he had some very serious baggage in hand, and this was unknown territory for me. So we took this sort of leap of faith and basically moved to Peru. But since we had for years and years been working on documentaries and then fiction in Mongolia, where we had spent, a lot of time researching the mining industry. Mongolia is a bit of an El Dorado as well. And in that case, we're talking about uranium, gold, copper, coal. And so mines of all sorts is something that somewhat of a specialty of ours. So it's very natural that we would be drawn up to the Andes into a territory that Peter already knew, and that we started roaming around with quite an open mind, a couple of story elements in mind, but we came across very quickly, immediately actually, the story of Choropampa, which you've mentioned, where there was this mercury spill, and it happened in June in 2000. There were trucks transporting from mercury from the Yanacocha mine, it's the South America's largest gold mine, down, and canisters were poorly attached to the back of a truck, and there was this colossal spill of 150 kilograms of mercury scattering through the village of Choropampa and 2 neighboring villages. And of course, the local people didn't know what it was, and gathered it, kept it, played with it, stored it in little vials under their pillow. Children were thrilled. I mean, it's a beautiful substance. And quickly a sort of cleanup crew arrived, but they didn't clean up adequately, and they didn't inform the local population about the dangers. And it's very well documented in documentaries. We saw documentaries about it. You can find them easily online immediately. You just look up Choropampa, and the whole tragic tale is there for all to see. And that this this tale was so heartbreaking. And then when you learn that the mine Yanacocha, which is an American, it's part of the Newmont Corporation, is didn't handle it well, and still still to this day it remains an unfolding tragedy, with a very overcrowded cemetery and everybody in the community suffering terribly from this spill. So we were deeply moved by this, horrified, obviously, and thought that this was a prime element in our story. And we knew from the start we wanted an image maker to come into this story as well, and that was the character of Grace that was built over time. Yeah, and then sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to mention, one of the articles that you kindly passed along to me the other day sort of spoke to the ways in which even today children have health effects that we watched, that we see unfolding in the film. There are still people again today who maybe in their 20s or 30s are passing away and having early deaths. So there's this way in which the film it's depicting events that still have so much resonance and power today.
Absolutely.
One of the other pillars that you discussed, where you're mentioning Grace, of course, but then the other pillar in terms of her character, but then also her as an actress, is Magali Solier. And of course, this is just, for me, she's been one of my, favorite actresses to follow over the past several years. Her film, I think I saw this maybe just right before Altiplano. So her new Chilean film, Lina de Lima, is fantastic. This is somebody who's, an artist representative for UNESCO, and essentially one of, if not the face of Peruvian cinema on an international scale. So I was just wondering whether you could speak about that experience of working with her. And just sort of maybe some key memories or something to that effect from experiences.
Well, she's phenomenal. I had seen her in we had seen her in Madenusa, film
Another
by
beautiful film, yes.
beautiful film, Claudia Yosa, and we met Claudia and befriended her, and we said, "Wow, we'd really like to meet Magali because she's the one." So we met in Lima, and I think even in probably our first trip there, and immediately we connected and had a very, very warm and trusting dialogue from the start. And she sensed that we were careful and cautious and aware of the minefield of the themes we were looking at, and but very she felt like we were very open-minded, and so she just tumbled into it with us. So I also told her from the start, I said, the character of Saturnina is something that is so bold and so demanding, that really required that she be part of the construction of the character on every level, so that she had to really dig around in the darkest corners of her past and really, bring to life in the role some very frightening and heavy, and at the same time light and true dimensions. And she got it. She totally understood. And so we built it together. We spent a lot of time together. Also for for me, I thought it was very important in the village where we shot in Cibayo that we spend time there together with the women of the community and getting to know each other. And
Yeah, this was actually my you
yeah.
know, sort of getting at my next question in terms of obviously, as we've mentioned, each of the films in the trilogy is sort of dealing with again environmental crises that are both very regional but also planetary, right? And so I was just wondering, as you were speaking to, you know, both yourself and Peter are a European filmmaking duo, so just speaking to some of the ethics and approaches for you that were really important coming into this, you know, very particular Latin American, or even more specifically, like indigenous Peruvian story. Again, as we mentioned, based on true events. For me, you know, Eduardo Galeano's famous text, "The Open Veins of Latin America," was like, you know, in mind during each screening of the film. But yeah, if you could just speak to some of the ways in which, you know, you approached working with, you know, the communities in which you were shooting, maybe some of the, you know, the ethical commitments or challenges, and how you navigated some of those spaces.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, we're very aware of ethical challenges. When you're working in a community that's not your own, how do you navigate this? At what point are you entitled to tell stories, and what's legitimate? How do you you know, sustain some integrity, authenticity? And I mean, making films is anyway such a collective effort. So yeah, it's very much rooted in our behavior from the start, which was to approach it as a collaboration with them. So and I mean, on every level. So working with anthropologists and sociologists, academics in Lima, Arequipa, reading extensively, and most importantly, spending time up in the Andes, in the region where we decided to shoot, to get a sense of these antagonisms, to attempt to understand them nominally, and to arrive at a comfort zone where we felt equipped. So we knew that every detail in the story had to be handled very carefully. We're talking about rituals and costumes and masks. I mean, this is all sacred territory, and there's this syncretism. So you have the Andean beliefs, you know, and rituals and traditions that have to be handled carefully. There's the Virgin, who is always surrounded by the sun and the moon, for example. This is the way it is there, and so it had to be studied carefully and respectfully. So all the artisans who recreated these masks are local, and we were really strict down to the finest detail, that every little detail of everything had to be correct. The morning scene next to Saturnina's coffin, when there are 7 angels and 7 devils who are having a game of dice
Right.
to determine where, you know, the destiny of her soul. I mean, these are all drawn from there. This is really how it happens. The burning of the clothes, for example, the masks of the Aukis, these mountain spirits that appear at several moments in the film. So we knew that this had to be handled really respectfully, and I think, I mean, this involves, you know, dozens and dozens of people, different skill sets, and giving them, you know, really the freedom to create, propose, to challenge us at all times, created an atmosphere of trust. So it's really made with them. It's not us coming in with, you know, preconceptions, with any kind of, prejudices, really. So it's a way of working that we know can, we're very, very aware. Also, same in Mongolia, we're not Mongolian, but I learned, I speak Mongolian, or spoke it. Language is critical, so I had to learn Spanish
Yeah,
too.
there's
But
so many languages in the film. That's something that one really has to be mindful of. I mean, myself, I'm bilingual, but then you understand that there's just this way in which the film acts as a not only is it sort of multi-locational, we're dealing with like different temporalities, but also of course different languages across those regions and so on, and the ways in which they interact.
Yeah, and Grace, I mean, she's speaking in Farsi with her sister, and it's like, what? So I mean, it's very complex, but that is the world that we live in. I mean, how many of us are dual nationalities, speak multiple languages, and it's.
One way that I think the film also sort of deals with this really in a really beautiful and very interesting way is through music, right? Where the music in the film also acts as this really interesting bridge, again, across different spaces, different sort of cultural boundaries. And so I was just wondering whether you could speak a little bit about some of the making of the music and how that came to be, because it's just such a potent part of the film.
Yeah, and it's very bold. I mean, music is one of the motors, it's undeniably a very, very important aspect of the experience. And music is it's so personal, so it's almost impossible to speak about music, but in the end, the true question is in the editing process when you're pulling it together is, does it work? I mean, for us as the makers and emotionally, and that was always that's the marker we used to use. And so, yeah, we had a piece in mind, Gorecki's Third Symphony, very early in the process, as well as a piece from Komitas, the Armenian composer, and Richard Einhorn, the American composer of contemporary classical music. So we had these sort of three pieces of music, which are large, they're very present, bombastic, you can even say, very, and you feel, I mean, they were they, in a sense, they were like lighthouses for us. Like they gave us our bearings during the process. We're like, wait, we have to come back to the timbre of that emotion, because that's really essential for the experience. And these pieces carried us through the whole process and survived, and we were able to negotiate the rights, and they're in the film. This doesn't always happen, but especially the piece of Gorecki, which carries the last 10 minutes of the film. This was really something we had to struggle to really wow, we have to really, in a sense, earn this, to feel like we've achieved something that is, that's worthy of incorporating this music, which is so majestic, so grand. Yeah. So, but in all of our films, we make quite bold choices in music, and there are no borders in music. We never have any ethical quandaries on that matter. But to come back to the ethics, I think we both hail from documentary, which I think is interesting to mention.
Yes, definitely.
And before Khadak, each of us made documentaries, me in Morocco, Peter in South America and in Mongolia, and then I was shooting in Mongolia, where we actually met there. And we came to a point where we had to make this necessary step into fiction, because that was where we felt most comfortable, and that was where we would navigate most freely and most effectively reach maybe truthful moments that were, and it was unexpected. Neither of us ever had any intention of directing fiction feature films. This was never in our radar, but it came out of a necessity, and it comes it's born from this, it's the fact that when you have a relationship with your subjects and your partners or so, when you're in a documentary environment, it's totally different from when you're in a fictional a fiction film construction. The pact is completely different, actually, because in fiction you have an agreement, we know the goal, we have a common end, there's a script, there are contracts, people are paid for their time and work, they're valorized for their input, they're listened to carefully. It's a completely different environment than and documentary is a completely other way of working. It involves a degree of manipulation naturally that's constantly there, and it's a different kind of pact and exchange, not to belittle or undermine documentary in any way whatsoever, not at all. But Peter and I both felt comfortable in making things clear. It's like, lay it all out, and this is how we're operating, and we're working together on this. So we felt really comfortable with that terrain, ethical terrain. It suits us much better. Yeah.
Just to transition just for a moment, but the film, like we talked about how sort of it's this interconnection of, again, different temporalities of different spaces, but also just, this, again, fictional town of Torobamba as sort of a meeting point, right, in terms of state violence, in terms of these extractive operations, in terms of locals, outsiders in the region working in the mines or working for NGOs. For me, one of the moments that really struck me the most recent time that I was screening the film is this moment where Max is speaking with a miner, just saying hello and these sorts of things. But it shows that it reminds us that oftentimes there are these points of interconnection, right, between NGOs and these mines, in various extractive zones, or so it sort of hints to some of those histories that may or may not be the case in this, fictional context. But essentially, for me, it reminds me of, Aníbal Quijano's concept of coloniality, or sort of the afterlives of colonialism. So I was just wondering, like, for you, as again, this sort of this nexus point of all these different histories of various forms of either colonial or state violence, how does one approach, filming this? Like, how does one approach filming coloniality or filming the Anthropocene? And obviously this is such a big question, but so I apologize for that. But any sort of, I don't know, like thoughts along the way in terms of capturing these huge forces, right, that impact all of us in different ways and on different scales all over the globe.
And all the time. Yeah. No, well, the more specific, the better. I mean, the more precise we could be in our storytelling, the bigger the story we could tell. I mean, it's from droplets of mercury tumbling through a village, and it's itinerant eye doctors who come in, who from their local perspective are part of a larger machinery of extraction, you can say. I mean, the outsider is, I mean, the suspicions and the antagonisms are really real, and yeah, and that brings to mind, there's one moment where the frustrated villagers who were visiting the cataract clinic leave because they start to mistrust the intentions of the doctors who are operating there, and they call they hiss as they leave the clinic, pistaco. And this is just a word dropped in the story, which is a fascinating dimension of the story. We don't explain it, but there it is. And pistaco is a sort of phenomenon. It's an old belief born from a kind of terror of the outsider. And there was this sort of mythical figure of the white man, tall, leather boots, sword. I mean, a lot of them came through there and left, centuries of destruction in their wake. But these pistaco figures are also, it's kind of a mythical figure, but it's a real fear that inhabits people's minds. And this pistaco figure is considered someone who who can kidnap children, who can, when people disappear, local communities have been known to blame this on the Pistacos. It's an idea that these foreign white men, they actually, they take the lives of locals and they purge their bodies, they dismember them, they take the body fat and they incorporate the body fat into the machinery that's used to extract minerals and to drive their trucks. And fascinating. So this is just one example of a very small element in the story, which is actually fits very naturally in the context, but leaves Max, for example, reeling, because he understands that he understands nothing of what's going on. He's naive, he's idealistic, he's there with good intentions, but he's part of a huge machinery, and he's perceived of anyway as an outsider, and outsiders have brought in general only strife and destruction, and left only so much pain and loss in their wake.
And I had kind of speaking to, going back just a little bit to the extractive zone itself, right, the mine in the region. I was wondering, this was something that again struck me, was you never again, unless if I missed it, you and Peter made the decision to never show the mine. Instead, we see, trucks, right? These trucks from the mine constantly going to and from in so many scenes. Like, I was really sort of paying attention to this, and the trucks are almost omnipresent. They're always there. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to this decision to never show the mine, right?
Well, there are two reasons. One is it never occurred to us because actually from the point of view of the community, all they see are these huge trucks leaving like huge clouds of dust, trucks that like storm through all over the Andes, these villages, and they just come storming through. It's part of the landscape, actually, these trucks. And that was sufficient for us, because that was also sort of the point of view of the villagers. All they see is the dust and the noise and the coming and going, without participating. They're like they're passed by by these aggressive machines that never slow down also. So this is they're there all the time, they're passing all the time, day and night, and this is so violent, and just the suggestion of where they're coming from and where they're going to and what huge machinery they're part of was for us sufficient. But then the other level is that because we're so open in how we operate, the story was clear, the intentions were clear, the partners all knew what we were doing, the local partners, the co-producers in Lima. I mean, you actually, we were never granted access to the mines. We because we love visiting mines, it's something we do, but we would never have been allowed to film, never would have been allowed to film in Yanacocha in a million years. So it never even, I mean, we knew that had we had that wish, it was an impossibility. We would have had to either buy archive imagery or so, but is from the point of view of the villagers, they are never allowed near these mines either, unless they work inside them. And it didn't seem so necessary. The canister, the mercury, tells the big story as well. And I mean, the intention was really not to identify Yanacocha and Newmont and to condemn this. There is enough. There are enough documentaries and about this, and investigative journalists who've worked on this, and NGOs working on this. We thought that which sort of added value could we bring, and this is in the fictional, more poetic approach and storytelling, where we thread these things together, and I think in the spirit of like suggesting that there's hope, for mutual understanding. yeah, and communication. Yeah.
Something that your comments are leading me to reflect on is just the way in which, you know, again, and this will lead to sort of my next question in regards to sort of zone thinking that potentially maybe in the film, but the extractive zone, right, the mine, both in the real events that the film is you know, drawing inspiration from, as well as in the fictional film, there's a way in which the mine doesn't just stay in the mine. Like the extractive zone doesn't just stay in this one place, right? It becomes, it moves to the town. So there's this sort of permeability, yeah, between, again, this idea of like, this is where the mining happens. It happens in this space, you know, over here, away from, you know, communities and these sorts of things. And that's just not the case.
No, not at all, because they're digging up sacred mountains. I mean, for these communities, these are living landscapes where that are really alive and full of spirits and spirits and have to be honored and respected and cared for. And the mines, like, you know, dig cavities out of mountainsides that should be left alone, and so there's an overlap constantly. The glaciers that are, you know, disappearing at a shocking rate in Peru. I mean, this alone is alarming, and that's all connected, actually. I mean, for some of their rituals, like Ignacio, the fiancé, has to go up. This is something that the groom does in that community. You have to go up and fetch a bit of ice from the glacier and bring it down, and you bless your bride with this. This is an ancient tradition, but there's, you know, the ice is disappearing. Like, yeah, this is also connected to the climate, the violence. Yeah.
Yeah, because of course the screening is, you know, a collaboration between, you know, our amazing partners at the Carsey-Wolf Center, but then also the media studies journal Media Fields, in this conference that's happening the next day after the screening on zones of mediation. And so the zone, of course, coming from the Greek, is about this idea of sort of girdling or encircling. And so I think some of the things that you've spoken to have sort of given us some initial initial entry points into sort of zone thinking, or some of the zone theorizations, right, that are happening in your film. I'm not sure if there's anything else that you wanted to speak to that specifically, since you already have kind of talked through it, but yeah, is there anything else you'd like to add before we move to, I think, maybe our last question?
I mean, when in the construction of the film, we're never thinking of theory. Even, yeah, as screenwriters. So in the initial phase of writing and research, where it's very like nuts and bolts, practical, the pragmatics of plot and all these things, and working with the story elements and how does it all fit together, where we are so deeply embedded in details and process that we don't only after the fact reflect a little about how could that be interpreted. So we never come in with that as a conscious intention to bring a theory to life, or even to embed symbols that are important to us. No, everything emerges from the work. Actually, everything emerges from the field work. But zoning, yeah, I mean, I think, but also interesting to note, Anthropocene was not even a word that we, you know, we used in those days. This is not so long ago. It's only quite recent.
This is like early 2000s, right? Like 2000.
Yeah, we were in Peru, beginning 2006, 5, 6, 7, 8. We shot in 8 and released the film in 2009. So it's not that long ago, actually, but we weren't thinking in those terms. We were just coming from years of field work in the mines and completely devoted to these themes in work we were doing in Mongolia. And we brought all this passion and conviction and curiosity to South America. But the Anthropocene, it's not even a word that was in our vocabulary at the time, which is very interesting. It's totally infused all of our films.
Yeah, all of these things are there. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But we're the history we're aware of. I mean, how, you know, the first when the Europeans first came into the region, they disrupted the entire ecosystem, and the decimation of the population meant that the forests grew rapidly, and then the coastline was totally transformed because the stories are endless. So we were aware of all these things, but not interpreting them in zoning.
I think even what you're speaking to in regards to you know, this last point, especially about the connections between colonialism and the Anthropocene in a scholarly context, and of course, you know, there's always some, you know, scholar or thinker or philosopher who sort of said earlier versions of things, but it seems that that particular connection is something that's become a lot more emphasized and thought through within the past, you know, 7 to 8 years, maybe a bit longer. But yeah. So in certain ways, there are certain you know, aspects of the trilogy holistically that are thinking through things that are even preceding some of the really important scholarship. Thinking about, of course, Catherine Yusuf's amazing book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None. But so yeah, I just think that that's something that's of note where yeah, where your films are thinking through these important intersections.
I guess we will have to leave that to the academics. We're just doing our craft.
The last question,
our ability and with all the convictions we have about you know, where we work and why we do what we do, and but we're hopeful nonetheless. I mean, I think dedicating so much and taking so much risk in order to create cinema is requires anyway a degree of hope that there is to what greater purpose in our humble sort of role in this whole thing is hopefully to transmit, you know, and to provoke you know, contemplation about the bigger picture. Of course, Choropampa, I mean, we're privileged, we're filmmakers based in Europe, and you know, we can fly to South America and create film with and you know, we don't suffer the tragedy that the people, for example, of Choropampa are suffering through, for sure. But it is our story. We're all part of this, you know, all of us are part of mechanisms that are part of the bigger picture. And so in the big picture, we do belong there as well. I mean, you know, I'm American born. The mine didn't take responsibility for the catastrophe in Choropampa as American. I mean, these are our stories. These are our stories. And some, you know, there are absolutely people who suffer much more than we do. But in the big picture, we are all suffering. Yeah.
Yeah, this is, again, just leading me to think about, you know, the ways in which, thinking again specifically within sort of Latin American cinema, you know, the ways in which the Anthropocene thinking is manifested within third cinema, perhaps, and all of these other sorts of questions that now I really want to begin to think through and research. So thank you so much for raising these points. The last question that I wanted to ask from you is, so in the film, the image, right? So photography in particular functions as a tool of inscription, recording, distributions, and we might add like remembering something like this, or remembrance, ideas of remembrance. We might think about the, you know, some of the opening scenes, of course, in terms of Grace being forced to capture, right, this act of violence to capture this murder. And then, of course, we have this politically motivated suicide at the end that's filmed. So could you speak a bit, you know, about how you were thinking through, because it seems to me that the film in that way is very much trying to think through the role of film and media of different sorts, right, in sort of this moment of climate disaster. So any just sort of maybe, reflections on that?
Well, I mean, I think that it's the fact that Saturnina films her own demise was a from the very beginning a crucial narrative plot point. So there was never any question about that. And the photograph of Omar as he's assassinated. So these two images, one a video image, which is like a weapon, and one a photograph that's made and compromised in a compromising situation, which ends up a celebrated image, but is something that is a source of huge trauma for the photographer herself. Had she not been there with that guy whose name was Omar, he would not have been assassinated. Yeah. So I mean, how powerful. And we're very we've been thinking about this, of course, for years and years, the role of the image and beauty. I mean, if you look at the controversial work figure of Salgado and his beautifying of poverty, you can say, and these are concerns of all of us image makers, but there's no denying that image making is age old. And it's used in so many multiple ways. It's an essential part of the human experience, and is a weapon sometimes, is dangerous, incredibly dangerous at others. It's a market, Yeah, I mean, I was, thinking in these past days about, all the, stories I know around me, colleagues of mine, filming poverty, for example, crossing over borders, filming the other, when are we entitled to do so, and who is entitled to do so, and who pays for it, and why, and where does it, where does this work end up? Actually, it's interesting to mention, one of the main sources of inspiration for the imagery in the film was actually TAFOS. It's a series of workshops in Peru between 1986 and 1998, where local communities up in the Andes, indigenous communities, were provided with cameras and photographed their lives. And the result is it's a stunning collection and archive of black and white photography, and those photographs we actually used in the construction of some of our scenes. So we actually literally recreated them. I mean, I have it here. This is the book, you see?
Yes. Right. Yes.
País de Luz. And so these images are a direct inspiration for some of our scenes, and these are, images shot through the lens of local people living up there, telling their own stories in their own manner, and so this, I think, it's important to mention. I think that in the case of those workshops there in those years, people were able to create an incredibly valuable document, but also their aesthetically shockingly beautiful collection of imagery. And so you have, it was a huge inspiration to us also, and it was a way, in a way, of borrowing. But okay, film is we're constantly borrowing and bringing things together. And that felt very, very, very right to recreate and rebuild images that had been lensed by people who live up there. We found that very valuable. Yeah, but we're the images is something to be at least thought about very carefully. I mean, I think that the best we can do is to stimulate the coming generations to slow down and think about, you know, the still image, the moving image, the tsunami of imagery, to take time and to think about the ethics of it. I mean, you all as academics and us as filmmakers, it's sacred territory and dangerous and powerful and exciting, and yeah, it's part of our life. It's all of us are surrounded by it. We consume it all day, every day, and sometimes without reflecting.
Yeah, some of your comments there are leading me to think about, we were chatting about this the other day, but the sometimes conscious, sometimes even unconscious influences of somebody like Andrei Tarkovsky in your work and these sorts of things. But these things will have to be discussed at another time. But I just wanted to thank you so much on behalf of, again, on behalf of the Carsey-Wolf Center, and also on behalf of the Media Fields Conference, Zones of Mediation, that'll be being carried out over the next 2 days. Thank you so much, Jessica, for your time and for offering these amazing insights into your still very, very important film. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.